I think a lot of times there's this expectation from sellers that once you negotiate on the price and the closing date and, the pre-closing occupancy or whatever it may be, that you're done, that all right, now we can start planning for our exit. And that's obviously not our reality. We've got so many things that we have to contend with, and the next big item is inspections. So historically in Naples and Southwest Florida in general, people have gravitated to the as-is contracts. No, definitely not. It's the opposite of that. People have gravitated to the standard contracts. In fact, just the name of it tells you all you need to know. The NABOR residential improved property contract, the sales contract, that's what we call the standard one. I would say it's a repair contract because the only way the buyer can get out of the deal is if there's a repair or a defect that the seller refuses to fix. That's the only way a buyer could get out of the deal and get their deposit returned. Outside of that, maybe there's a finance contingency, maybe there's something else, but that's the key. That's the key difference between the NABOR residential improved sales contract and the as-is sales contract. On an as-is, as you are aware of, my favorite sales contract, whether I'm the buyer or the seller, that one, the buyer can get out of the deal and get their money back in their sole discretion. Any reason under the sun. They can do whatever they want, they can get it back. FAR. Let's start with FAR. So FAR has two sales contracts as well. It has the standard sales contract and it has the as-is. Let's see if I can pull up our standard. And the reason why I want to start with FAR is because I know a lot of my audience doesn't know the FAR as well. I know it's not something that you gravitate towards. Here in Naples, the reality is we use the NABOR contract 90+% of the time. But if you go up into Bonita, if you go into Fort Myers, Charlotte County, anywhere else in the state, the reality is we need to be able to know the FAR contract. Or alternatively, if an agent from out of town comes into our neighborhood and wants to make an offer, you're going to see the FAR standard or the FAR as-is contract. Now, one of the reasons I love the as-is is because you can pivot really easily between FAR and NABOR because the inspections are the same. Sole discretion, put in your number of days, and you're golden. If you are, I would say if you're a Naples agent and you're pivoting over to Lee County and you need to make an offer on a FAR contract, use the as-is. It's just going to simplify everything. There's a lot less for you to understand, and you're going to make a lot less mistakes. But if you wanted to use the standard, so this is the residential contract for sale and purchase. It looks similar to NABOR. I mean, it's got a couple of different formatting things, but on the first page, you're going to put in your purchase price and your deposit. You've got your personal property items and your legal description. You're going to have a closing date, if there's any leases, and whether it's assignable. So right up until line 87, I would say it's really similar between NABOR and FAR. Really, really similar. Financing is wildly different in FAR sales contracts. Wildly different. But this is an inspection day, so we're not going to talk too much about financing. We're going to skip over that. Closing costs. I like this about FAR. You'd pick who's going to pay for the title. Is it the seller paying and choosing who does the closing, or is it the buyer paying and choosing who does the closing? I actually really like that as an option. I wish NABOR made it that simple. They don't. Obviously, in NABOR, if it's Collier County, the buyer's going to pay, and if it's Lee County, Charlotte County, the seller pays. Scroll all the way down. Property maintenance is pretty much the same. The seller has to maintain the property. And then we get into our inspection, property inspection and repair. So the very similar between NABOR and FAR is the buyer has so many days and the default would be 15. 15's a lot. It's just a lot. I wonder if you guys want to say in the comments if you usually use or get 15 days. If you're a listing agent, is 15 days too much? I think it's too much. I think 10 days, 12 days, maybe 8 days if the seller can negotiate a smaller inspection period. And so the way FARBAR looks at it is it's not defect or cosmetic. Instead, they talk about property condition and working items. Um, Dana suggests always doing 10 days. I agree. I think 10 is a great way. And then when I was working in law school, I worked at the prosecutor's office. And in the white collar crime division, they kind of had this mindset of like they start at 10 years. And obviously, these are for felony offenses. They'd start at 10 years and then they would, the aggravating circumstances or mitigating circumstances might raise or lower the number of years that they were willing to agree to. So they'd start at 10, and if it was really bad, they go up to 12 or 15 or 20. But if it wasn't as bad, maybe they could go down to 5. I would say it's the same thing with inspections. Depending on the time of year, the type of offer, how good of an offer it is, what's already been done, what kind of property it is. You start at 10, and if it's really going to need a lot, maybe you go to 12, maybe you go to 15. But if it's pretty straightforward condo deal, I would want that a little bit lower, hopefully. So the big difference between FARBAR and NABOR when you're using their standard forms is that in NABOR, the seller can refuse to make certain repairs. In FARBAR, the seller cannot. The seller is obligated to do the repairs that are itemized per their inspection, so long as it doesn't go over a certain limitation, a certain amount. So if we go back up to the cost, this is the first section that we really need to make note of. Seller shall pay the following amount / percentages of the purchase price for the following costs and expenses. The important word on there is shall. In FARBAR, the seller does not have the choice to say no. They are obligated to do the repairs. And so again, if you are a Naples agent wanting to write on a FARBAR contract, this could really trip you up. This is very different, and you may have just scanned right by it the way I did when we first went through the sales contract. Or if you do it, maybe you focus more on the as-is contract, because then you don't have to worry about these. This section is actually removed on the FARBAR as-is contract. So here it itemizes the 3 different kinds of repairs that the seller is obligated to perform. So you've got general repair items, think broken dishwasher, leaky roof, cracks in the foundation. And then you've got wood destroying organism treatment and repairs. And then also you have costs associated with open permits, expired permits, things of that nature. If prior to closing, seller is unable to meet the maintenance requirement as of paragraph 11 or the repairs, replacements, and treatments above, then sums equal to 125% of the estimated cost shall be put into escrow at closing. If the actual cost of maintenance requirement or repaired items exceed these amounts, seller shall pay the actual cost, but not to exceed the limits above. Any unused portion of the escrow's amount shall be returned to seller. So if let's say it's $1 million deal and there was $15,000 worth of general repair items and you had selected 1.5%, so that's 15,000, the seller would be obligated to put 15,000 in escrow because that's the maximum that they're going to be obligated to do. So that's very different than NABOR. I'm going to challenge you guys. Who knows how much you're supposed to put in escrow when it's NABOR? That's the question I want you to answer. When it's NABOR, tell me, how much do you put in escrow? And does it have this cap that FARBAR has? So I'll let you guys answer that. Don and Mark, they said they usually call the inspectors to see how quick they can get it inspected. Absolutely. So if you're negotiating something over the weekend, it comes Monday and the seller is saying, hey, we don't want to give you the 12 days or the 15 days. Call your inspector and tell them, hey, when's the quickest I can get you on the list? It seems like we're going to have a deal here, and can I get you for Thursday? And so, in that case, you'll be able to tell your buyer, We can get the inspection in day 4. You'll get the report day 5. You'll have all weekend to think about it, get quotes, and then we'll be able to make our election or whatever it may be, within our time frame. All right, so Judy and Liz both got it right. 200% of the escrow amount. So in NABOR, it's 200%. So on that same $15,000 repair for either a general repair item or what they would call in NABOR, they call it a defective item. So in that instance, when you get to closing, NABOR, you can demand a 200% escrow. So $30,000 gets held in escrow until the work is done. And then in FAR it's 125%, but capped by how much the seller is actually obligated. So good, you guys are on top of it. I love it. So this is the first part that really matters. You know what you didn't see in these 3 sections? Mold and radon. Mold and radon are not in this at all. They just aren't. So please keep that in mind. If you are doing a contract and you want to make sure that you do a mold test and a radon test, you're going to have to add it in as a general repair item or some sort of additional item as well. All right, so Neil's challenging me here. You mentioned you prefer the as-is, but if you have the buyer with a residential improved contract, do you not think it makes the buyer a little more committed? And that's the rub. That's the real question. It does make the buyer more committed because they have more to lose. So in Neil's scenario, he's saying you have a buyer that makes an offer, they start doing their inspections, and then they get cold feet. In an as-is contract, the buyer could just terminate. They could say, hey, we thought about it last night. I know we've wasted everybody's time, but we're terminating and we want our deposit returned. In that scenario, yes, the buyer can get out, the deal falls apart, the seller has to go back on the market. That's a problem, generally, especially if that keeps happening. And in today's market, that's happening a lot. So there's a downside for sure. But let me give you the other side of it. Let's say that same buyer calls you and says, hey, I'm having second thoughts. We want to terminate. They're not focused on the sales contract as much. They're calling you to say, hey, I want out. And now you have to be the bearer of bad news to say, you're going to lose your deposit. And they might be able to sue you for more, possibly. Now it's like, well, why didn't you tell me that ahead of time, Neil? Why am I just finding that about now? The reality is that we get ourselves in this pickle of we're on your side, let's find the beautiful house. And as soon as they change their mind, the contract turns on them and they'll turn on you. So there's definitely it's a double-edged sword. It's a great option for the buyer. I think it protects the relationship between you and your buyer. But could it lead to a deal falling apart if you have someone that gets cold feet or buyer's remorse? Yes, absolutely, without a doubt. And sometimes the listing agents are more worried about it than you are. The listing agent and the seller, they're like, well, I don't want the buyer to have the ability to get out of the deal. And I get that too. I do. I really do. The thing that I really struggle with on a FAR standard contract is that the seller is obligated to do the repairs. And that's tough because sometimes sellers want to be able to say no. And then on the other side of it, the buyer is obligated to make, to ask for the repairs. And that can be tough. So and then on NABOR, the other side, the problem with that one is it drags first from a seller's perspective. So the seller, you have your inspection period, and then there's a 5-day buyer election, 10-day seller response, and then a 5-day buyer response. So a 10-day inspection period really balloons into potentially 30 days of dealing with inspection items. That's why I don't like standard. The time that it takes to get an answer. Whereas if you had a 10-day inspection, it's done. And so it's a great question, Neil. I'm glad you brought it up. Keep bringing those types of questions, everybody. That's what I want this conversation to be about. So if we go down to the inspection period, so if buyer fails to deliver to seller a written notice or report required by B, C, D below, then except for seller's continuing maintenance, buyer shall have waived the seller's obligation. So NABOR and FR both have this. The buyer has to actually notify the seller of the defects or the repair items. They have to do that. So they have to get an official inspection with a report, forward the report. Now, in FARBAR, that's as far as it goes. You don't have to do a buyer election. You just tell the seller, we want these items fixed. And you send them the inspection report, put it in an email, and say, hey, the roof is leaking, the window is leaking, and the dishwasher is broken. Please fix it. That's enough. That's all you have to do. NABOR, as we will find out, you have to make your buyer election, and you have to put that in a form. It has to be signed. The seller then signs it. It's a little different, but you hope to get to the same spot. So those items specified in 12B(I) below, which seller is obligated to repair, may be inspected by a person who specializes. Buyer shall, within the inspection period, inform seller of any general repair items that are not in the condition required below by delivering a written notice, and upon written request by seller, a copy of portion of professional inspector's report dealing with such items. So a simple email saying, we want these items fixed. That's all you have to do in FARBAR. The tricky part is from a listing agent verifying, well, what are my limitations? Is this a general repair item? Is it wood destroying organisms? Is it permit item? And what do those costs look like? So the following items shall be free of leaks, water damage, structural damage, ceiling, roof, exterior walls, doors, windows, foundation. And then the above items together with pool equipment, non-leased major appliances. Basically, these are your, actually, let me read this part to you. Shall be maintained until closing in working condition as defined below. These are very similar to NABOR, the definitions of what's working condition, what's not, and then defective item versus cosmetic. Very, very similar. Sellers obligated to make such general repairs as are necessary to bring items into the conditions specified in 12B(II) above. Seller shall, within 10 days after receipt of their notice, either have the reported repairs to general repair items are completed, or have the repairs estimated by a licensed professional. Oh, there he is. Welcome back.
Sorry about that.
So we're going over inspection items, and I figured we'd start with the FARBAR. If buyer and seller's inspection reports differ and the parties cannot resolve their differences, buyer and seller together shall choose and equally split the cost of a third-party inspector. If cost repair is less than, equal to, or less than the general repair limit, seller shall have the repairs made. Shall is the important question, or the important point. Have it done. If cost repairs exceed, then within 5 days after receipt of the last estimate, seller may elect to pay the excess by delivering notice. So a simple email saying, we're just going to give you a check. Or buyer may deliver written notice to seller designating which repairs they want them to make and agreeing to accept the balance in as-is condition. If neither party delivers such written notice to the other, then either party may terminate this contract. So that $15,000 limit, you have $20,000 in repairs, you've got receipts, you've got all this stuff. The buyer can say, well, I want these things done, these 3 items, these 5 items, and that should be your $15,000. Or, I'll take a check. And so that's where that language is. Quite different than NABOR, huh, Dad?
It is. The one thing I would tell people to look out for, the seller has the option of paying the excess. So when you have the 1.5, the 1.5, the 1.5, and I think it's paragraph 9, only 2 paragraphs allow the seller to pay the excess, general repairs and permits. The wood destroying organism, it does not. So from a strategy perspective, I try to go low on general repair items and low on the permits if I'm representing the seller, and a higher number on wood destroying organisms.
Yeah, so to clarify that, the seller wants control. The seller wants to be able to say a low limit, but that I can always overcome and keep the deal together.
Yes.
except for which one item, Dad? Does the seller not have
The
right?
wood destroying organisms. See,
So
there's
the
some.
termite one, you want a higher limit because the seller can't just keep the deal together.
Yeah,
So
the
that's
buyer
a little tricky.
buyer might be afraid of what's behind the walls, the sheetrock, so they want out, and the seller wants the opportunity of keeping him in the deal. If you have $1 million deal and you put 1.5 down for each one, you're looking at $45,000 in potentially for the whole thing. But you could do like five for general, five for permits, and a more reasonable number for the wood destroying organisms.
Exactly. Yeah, it's a little tricky. If we compare this to NABOR, there's a little bit more math and strategy that you have to do in advance. You've got to add the mold and radon if that's something you want. You've got to really consider your limitations on the amounts and
Right.
maybe dealing with wood destroying organisms separately, maybe having a higher amount there. There's a lot of work there, and if you get it wrong, the seller could be obligated to fix everything, or the deal could fall apart because the buyer could just pull it out and say no.
There's a lot more strategy with the far bar, and like you said, there are things missing like the mold and the radon. But in some situations, I mean, you can look at the standard NABOR as kind of an as-is contract from the seller's perspective. This is one where the seller says has the
Yeah.
ability to keep the buyer in, and if they want to, if they really want to
Yes,
hold their
it's
feet
a
to
great
the
that's
fire.
a great point. We always talk about NABOR as having two as-is contracts, and that's
Yeah,
because the seller can say no.
then the
But
buyer.
in FAR bar, you really only have one as is. The other one, the standard contract, the seller can't say no. So to Vicky's question, she asked if the repair item costs more than the contract states, can the buyer walk away and get the deposit back if the seller refuses to fix or pay for the overage? So in permitting and general repair items, the seller can keep the buyer from terminating, can keep the buyer's deposit by saying, we're going to cover the overage. Hey, you sent us
Right,
$100,000 in repairs. We're going to do all of them. In
right.
which case, the buyer does not to get their deposit back.
Yes.
Now, if the seller refuses to fix or pay for the overage, then
The
dad
buyer has an opportunity to cancel.
then the buyer has the opportunity to cancel. They would get their deposit back in that scenario. Great question, Vicky. That's perfect. So that is FAR bar. There's good about it because it obligates the seller to go through with the repairs. The thing that I always struggled with is that um, sometimes the sellers don't want to. They just don't want to. They can just say no, and then they turn on you if you didn't explain it correctly, or even if you did explain it correctly, but they're bitter. They never expected that the roof needed to be replaced. Yikes. And Dad, is there any limitation on a particular item the way NABOR has in line 327?
Under the definition of cosmetic on page 7, the limitation would be
Well,
that
no,
the.
this FAR bar. So FAR bar, I don't
Oh, I
think there
thought
is
you
a
were talking about
limitation, right?
NABOR, limitation on the NABOR.
Yeah, so the limitation, NABOR, I don't know, it's a little tricky. You can always say, well, that's a 20-year-old pool heater. I'll give you the $20 that it's worth. FAR bar, you can't do that. If a
No,
pool heater is broken and it's 8 grand for a new pool heater, the seller's gonna have to fix it.
even if it's a 20-year-old, heater or air
Even if
conditioner.
it's a 20-year-old heater, if it hasn't worked in 20 years, the seller is obligated to fix it. And I could see that being a pretty bitter pill to swallow from a seller's perspective because it's true. A lot of my clients, they say, well, I've never even used it. I didn't know the pool light was broken because I haven't swam in 9 years.
I would use the standard FAR bar for certain situations where you have a sophisticated seller. Their primary goal is to keep this buyer in. You have a big deposit, and they're aware of the risk. And if there's a finance clause, you've explained that to them. You explain what's included, what's not included, and walk them through this whole dueling appraisal contest.
Yeah, I'd say it's tricky.
CEOs, somebody who's done this before. It's not their first home they've bought.
So Don asks, what happens if the seller had disclosed those items in the seller disclosure? It doesn't matter,
The
right?
forest seller's disclosure does
Doesn't
not
matter. So
remove it.
yeah, seller spends, all weekend filling out a seller disclosure and tells them, "Hey, the pool heater is broken. It's never worked." The buyer can still make you fix it because unlike NABOR, it doesn't get removed as a general repair item. It's still there. It's still something the buyer can ask for and demand that the seller fix.
Seller's disclosure is good in some regard. It has the roof ever leaked, things like that, even though it's been repaired. I like that part. Not having the mold or radon in there, is a problem because it's a standard in Collier County, and you almost have to throw it in there. And like you said, the buyer signing it is not so much an issue.
Yeah,
It's still a general repair item, whether the buyer signs it or not
right.
on
And so
NABOR.
there's a lot to glean from that. So Ken asks, I always recommend, or he doesn't say he asks, he gives a suggestion. I always recommend my sellers to have a pre-listing inspection. That's beautiful. I love that. So it's a little bit of money. It's an investment for sure. I've actually had agents that also do an appraisal, just so that they can give their seller some confidence as to what the price should be. When they're negotiating and they think, "Oh my gosh, I'm never going to get an offer,"
Hmm.
or this person's lowballing me, say, "No, this is what the appraisal said. This is not a surprise to us. This is normal." I love all those things. Having a pre-listing inspection is very helpful if you then go and get those things fixed, or you disclose it to your buyer in advance. They make their offer based on that, and you just kind of formulate a contract that fits everyone's understanding.
We do have an
Um,
agent who does this, Christian, and she does it on high-end properties. And it not only it protects the seller because you hired somebody to tell the buyer what the heck's going on, but it also sets the deal off in the right note. There's a feeling
does
of they're less apt to go get another inspection that might contradict this, and you're in honest to goodness trying your best to be forthright. And if you do end up in a fight, your witness is going to be the guy who did the inspection report.
Yeah, yeah. Some more questions. Yvette, she says, now I understand why FAR agents in Lee County don't provide seller disclosures. Oh goodness. I didn't know that was pretty common, but let me take 30 seconds, give you my elevator pitch on seller disclosures. It protects sellers. You need to do them. There's no disclaimer in the world that will protect a seller better than filling out a seller's disclosure. Dad, you and I got some emails over the past couple of weeks, and they were saying that some of these high-end listings, really high-end, they just put some disclosure language in MLS and they refuse to do a seller disclosure. And I just think that's bonkers. The safest thing a seller can do is to have a seller's disclosure. Period.
Absolutely, 100% agree. And if I could add to that, the lawsuits we've been through over the last 30 years, they always come up with things that they wouldn't have cared about if they found out about it pre-closing. So
Yeah,
they're kind of inflating why they, are suing
yeah.
you.
Because they have some
Uh,
leverage. They
yeah,
find out about it
so
last
so
second.
it's 1,000 times easier to resolve an issue if you disclose it beforehand than if they find out about it afterwards. Plus, if they find out about it afterwards, they're questioning whether or not you're honest, whether this was to manipulate them, and they're angry, even if it's over a relatively minimal financial dollar amount.
Yeah,
You played
completely
me.
agree. A little
You
more than 30 seconds, but yeah, everyone needs to be doing seller disclosures. Don't get cute. Just do a seller
protect
disclosure.
the seller,
Say,
absolutely.
I
And
don't know, and then you're fine. And to that point, someone asked me yesterday, is there any risk if the buyer doesn't have an inspection at all? Let's say they put zero or they waive their inspections. Should I get them to sign a waiver so that they understand there are no inspections? And I told them no. I said that is not necessary. You don't need a waiver. But I prefer, as a seller, when a buyer has an inspection period, 7 days, 5 days, 9 days, whatever it is, give them a week to do an inspection, whether they decide to do it or not. give them a week. During that time period, they could get out of the deal, they could cancel it, whatever. Like in that way, if something does come up right before closing, 2 months after closing, whatever it is, you can say, we gave you a seller disclosure, we gave you an inspection. It's not our fault that you decided to do nothing with it.
And the paradox is if you give the buyers 0 days for inspections, you have now raised the bar on what you have to disclose under Johnson v. Davis. Because the test is this something that's readily discoverable by the buyer? Well, it's not readily discoverable if you're not going to let them in the front door. So,
Brings up
not
another point.
yeah, my door's locked.
I've had agents who refuse to open the email with the buyer's inspection report, or they'll say, don't send me the report. I don't want to see it. That's ridiculous. If they email you the report, if they offer you the report, you just choosing not to open it does not absolve you from liability.
A great
That,
lawsuit against the agent.
that's so silly. And I could imagine being in front of the court and saying, "But I never opened it. I told him not to send it." Okay,
You can't
you
close
have a
your
duty
eyes
to disclose.
there,
Crazy. Yeah,
it-
so Yvette follows up. She says the seller agents always tell me it's to avoid the lawsuits that they've experienced in the past as to why they don't do a seller disclosure.
it's professional malpractice, period, end of story.
It's yeah, it creates lawsuits. The only time a lawsuit could come from a seller disclosure would be if they lied. That's it. Don't lie. Oh, goodness gracious. Vicky, so you're going to give me the transition back into NABOR. So for all our agents that want to learn about FAR bar, stop here. 1034, it's done. Vicky says, so are you saying that if a defect is disclosed by the seller, it will be the seller's obligation to fix it? Is this true both NABOR and FAR bar standard contracts? Okay, couple of things to digest there. NABOR's different. The NABOR standard contract in the seller's disclosure actually says in it that if it's disclosed on the seller's disclosure and signed by the buyer in advance of contract or at the same time of contract,
Right.
then the buyer accepts these things not as defects, but as cosmetic. So basically, they waive the right to consider them a
Yeah, it
defective item.
specifically says it's not a defective item under D2B of the NABOR contract. So it's
Much better said than I did. Yes, exactly. So that's in the standard NABOR. That does not exist in the standard FAR bar. But Dad, does that language have any effect on an as-is contract?
no, because defective items is not defined in an as-is contract.
Right, not the same. And Dad, what if you use a NABOR seller's disclosure because you like that language
Right.
on a FAR bar sales contract? Does it have any effect?
Doesn't mean squat.
Doesn't mean squat. So they teach oftentimes, don't mix forms.
That's a Latin word.
Ed, you and I mix forms all the time. It happens. You might use a FAR bar listing with a NABOR sales, but there are certain forms you can't mix or that
Well,
will
the
have
buyer's
no
election,
effect.
the buyer's election with an as-is contract, that borders on malpractice too, because you got that language in the bottom that the buyer has 5 days to cancel if the seller says no. And it's an as-is contract, and it might be day 11. Yeah.
Here's the language for that seller disclosure. Notice to buyer, any defective inspection items contained in the seller disclosure statement signed by buyer prior to buyer's election or execution of any offer or counteroffer shall not be deemed defective inspection items under standard D2B. Yeah, that's pretty helpful, right, Dad? I like that.
Yeah, look at the signature line though. If the buyer signs, and that flows into a related topic, when somebody calls you and you're driving your car, should I sign this seller's disclosure? I always say no, because look what it says. I mean,
Yeah,
I don't know
buyer
what's in the
acknowledges receipt of the seller disclosure and he understands that any defective inspection items contained signed by buyer prior to buyer's execution shall not be deemed defective inspection items under standard D2B.
So I
Yeah.
tell my buyers, if in doubt, don't sign it. Even if I had it in front of me, let's say there was a patch in the valley of the roof, and then you have your inspection and you find out that there's another problem with the roof. The other attorney is going to argue that it's related to the original one and therefore it's not a defect anymore. So I hate to say it, I tend to tell people don't sign it. If you're on the seller side, you want to verify they got it. Save the email, make a little note that you spoke to the agent that they got the disclosure. Um,
So I'm
but
going to modify your advice just slightly. And I'm not
sure.
saying I disagree with you.
No, you can.
I think that we have to keep in mind what we're trying to accomplish. So if we are trying to give the buyer every ability to get out of the contract or to demand that the seller
Right.
fix something, if we're trying to gain the maximum amount of leverage, your advice is excellent. Don't sign the seller disclosure because otherwise you're taking things off the table that are otherwise defective items,
Right.
right?
And I haven't had a chance to read it, so I don't
Right.
know what's in there.
Now, the downside of having that reaction on every transaction is maybe that's inappropriate, right?
They
Maybe,
irritate the other side. Yeah.
yeah, think of
You
the
got
other
to put it.
side. What did Earl Fry say to you, Dad? Leave a little something in the deal for the next guy.
Yeah.
Um, you
He
know,
had a list of rules, and that was
He
one of
had, yeah, he had his Yogi Berra rules basically. But
them. Don't
I
go
would think
broke.
about it this way. That let's go back to that 20-year-old pool heater that's not working and the seller has never even turned it on because it's never worked for them.
Right.
You put it on the seller's disclosure. The seller really doesn't want to be on the hook for paying for a new one. And the buyer says, "I'm not signing it." You're kind of dead in the water. How are you going to get the deal across the line if we're still off by the 8 grand? The seller's
Well,
trying to, be honest and open about I'm not fixing this.
if you have a big deposit and the seller is willing to offer more than what a 20-year-old pool heater is worth, you have a good claim against the deposit. Plus, what I try to do is a brand new pool heater is going to be way more energy efficient. So you're paying one way or another. You're going to have high electric bills with that 20-year-old pool heater versus
Well,
lower
and
electric
I
bills.
think you have to think about it from the whole deal. The
Yeah,
purpose is to get it under contract, protect your customer, and get
yeah,
it closed.
right.
It's the tripod. You fall over if you don't have all three of those. If you get it under contract and closed, but your buyer gets screwed, that doesn't work. And if you're screwing the other guy, that doesn't really work either. It just doesn't work. You just have to be educated about it. So
Yeah.
if the listing agent's saying, look, I need the seller disclosure to be signed. I gave it to you a week ago. My seller will not go under contract until you acknowledge it. You got to read it. You got to see what's on it because it could have an effect on your sales contract. Because when it says pool heater, you're going to point it out and say, okay, buyer, they want us to sign it. By signing this, you're not going to be able to ask them to replace the pool heater. Okay, I just
I
need to
mean,
know.
you do have to be flexible. One thing I've seen a lot of, though, Christian, is the seller will agree to do things that he's not obligated to do under the contract. And
Which
then
I like. I don't have a problem with that.
no, but like he'll the 20-year-old air conditioner say he'll agree to replace it, but he doesn't know that he wasn't obligated to do so under the cosmetic paragraph on page 7. So you got to tell the guy like when your sister was buying her house, the air conditioner died.
I have a sister.
You have a sister. She runs the family, in case you're wondering, but
Hmm.
yeah, you shared a room with her, for God's sakes. You know
Yeah,
her.
so in my sister's scenario, they went through their inspections, they did their buyer election, and then the air conditioner pooped out the day before closing. And
Mhm.
and my sister and the seller got together and they split the cost of a new unit. The
Right,
seller had no obligation to do that. He probably had an obligation to get it back running. It was probably going to
right.
cost him $1,000 to get it running. So he offered to kind of share the cost of just getting her a new one, and that's what they
Yeah.
did. It was great. It was not a highly negotiated, leveraged thing where we looked at the contract. It was get them on the phone. What can we do? What's reasonable?
And
And
the
then
seller was a nice person, and with your sister, I told Aaron. I mean, thank God it didn't break it down the week after you close. Then
Yes.
you'd really be up the creek.
Exactly. It's about presenting it correctly or positioning it for your buyer or your seller so that they have the
Yeah.
best kind of reaction. I never get on the phone without kind of knowing all the angles and seeing how I can help this customer make a good decision. One that's
Yeah.
good for their pocketbook, good for the closing, and good for their moral, thoughts. Just can I keep them on the right path? And certainly not going to lie to them. I'm going to give them all the options, but I'm going to kind of guide them to do the right thing and do what they're allowed to do. Now, if I
Well,
get on the phone and the seller's like, "I've been beat up on this deal left and right and I'm exhausted and I have no money to give," then all right, let me point to you in the contract that says you're not obligated to do anything more than, the value of the unit. It's very interesting. All right, let's jump into NABOR. So the seller disclosure is a big deal. It's a big deal because you got cosmetic and defective items. The first thing to look at with NABOR is you got to elect to get an inspection. Now, Dad, I think it's very silly that they even have this section. And as a member of the Legal Resources Committee, I think you should propose that this entire section gets removed. Silly. If it's zero, then there should just be language in there that says I waive my inspection rights.
didn't you get me on this committee
Yeah,
there?
yeah, you don't need to tell them all that. All right, so now we keep going. Um, we're going to keep going down to inspections.
Thank
Again,
you,
this
Christian,
looks
by the way.
this looks very similar to FAR. The big difference, there are a couple of big differences. The first one is you're not spelling out the percentages. You're not doing 1.5%, 2%, 5%. The
Right.
only limitation that's really on here is line 327. No cost to repair or replace any systems and equipment item shall exceed the fair market value of that item if it were in working condition. This is a massive part of the inspection language. And it goes back to that pool heater. A 20-year-old pool heater, let's say it cost 8 grand to put in a new one because there's
Mhm.
just no way to bring it back to life. No cost to repair or replace any systems equipment shall exceed its fair market value of that item
Yeah,
if it were in working condition. So if that 20-year-old pool heater was working, what is it worth?
the whole 95.
Probably, yeah, not very much. We usually see the pool heater, the water heater, the dishwasher, and so here's how I do it. I typically tell the buyer, tell the seller. I'll talk to the seller first. I'll say, 20-year-old pool heater, here's the language. Maybe it's worth $100. Maybe it's worth $300. Let's offer double that. Let's offer 500 or 1,000 because we know that a new one is 8,000 or 6,000. So let's not give them any reason to fight us on the fair market value. Let's go over and above. Let's be generous. Let's be kind with a strategy. Our strategy is they can't fight us on our evaluation of the fair market value. The water heaters are even better example because a water heater is like $2,000, maybe less. And if you
Right.
offer them $500 for a 12-year-old water heater, there's no fighting you that
Oh,
you've,
you have to also make sure they know that clause is in there because a lot of
yeah,
people I run into just overlook it entirely.
yeah.
So, hey, look, I mean, we don't have to do this, but we're doing it because we're incredibly nice people, and that helps make the deal go smoother.
Yep. All right. So getting into the inspection items themselves, far bar again, we had the working condition items. Here we have defective and cosmetic, and it points out several different things. So you've got number one, all the appliances, equipment, including sprinklers, irrigation. It has
Mhm.
plumbing, it has doors and windows and roofs and ceilings and all that stuff. This is collectively systems and equipment, very similar to general repair items. I'd say they're
Yeah.
they're almost identical, Dad. They're really similar.
Yeah.
But then NABOR goes further. So they've got radon, which Farbar did not have. They've got lead-based paint. Farbar does not have that, as far as I know. Termites or wood-destroying organism. Farbar does have that. And then the mold. Farbar doesn't have mold. And then the existence of oven permits, which Farbar obviously has. So here there are six. Farbar has three. So this is definitely more exhaustive. It's a bigger list of items that a buyer can object to and say, hey, the mold is too high, where we elect for you to remedy that or mitigate the mold. So you basically, in that scenario, you do your inspection, just like in FAR You send them the report, just like in FAR but then you actually write out a buyer election. And there's a form for it. You're going to specify all the things, and you're going to include on their permits, and you're going to include on their defective items and systems and equipment and all that stuff. And you're basically asking the seller to fix it all. Hey, seller, fix it.
And you
Fix
get
it.
one election, Christian, just one. So don't
Yeah,
forget the.
one election, and that is tricky. Now, Dad, what's the advice for asking for repairs or credits? Because you only get one election, what's the advice on repair, asking for a repair, asking for a credit?
I have conversations with the buyer on whether or not they might be interested in, if they're going to be doing any remodeling to their new home, whether they want to use this credit as subsidizing a better stove or a better, whatever the heck it might be, a better hot tub. So if they want to use it as an, part of the method of paying for an upgrade, ask for the credit. And you can go out and get, an estimate and ask for it. People don't want to do the work themselves. Sellers don't want to do the work themselves.
Oh, don't tell them that. Dude,
Well,
I want the money. Give me the money.
nobody wants to do the work, but in some situations you're better off because if you do the work, you're working with the builder, for example, and you have the warranty and breach of contract actions against the builder. Plus, you have his phone number. Plus, from the realtor's perspective, your buyer has a direct relationship with the buyer, and they're not calling you, the realtor, 4,000 times a day asking you call the listing agent and find out why the roofer hasn't showed up yet. So
Well, and I'll give you more reasons why, you have to be thoughtful about what you ask for. Okay,
yeah,
so on a buyer election, you can ask for repairs, or you can ask for the credit, or you can
right.
ask for both, right? You
Oh,
can get a combination
sure,
of the
right,
two.
right,
Couple of things that I've learned. Number one, you have to list out all those items. So there's a list for all the repair items, whether you're asking for a credit or a repair, have to list all the defects. So that's
right,
the first thing, whether you're asking for a credit or repair. And then if you're asking for a credit, you need to have an invoice that goes along with it. And if you don't have an invoice, it's null and void. It's not a good repair request. So that's a lot of work. So I don't like doing that. I want to ask for the repair. And then, Dad, you had the mindset of I want the seller to do it. I don't want to do the repair. I don't want to, but that's
if you
challenging too.
here's the again the if you ask for the repair, the seller's going to try to do it as cheaply as possible.
Absolutely.
And
But
if
you
this
have to ask for the repair. That's the point I'm getting to. You have to
oh
ask for the
if
repair.
you don't have the estimate, yes, you
Yeah.
do.
So let's think about it on a strategy perspective.
Right,
Just ask for the repair and then call the listing agent and say, we'd rather just some money. And they'd say, oh, okay, well, how much do you think? And then behind the scenes, you'll negotiate. Is it 5,000? Is it 4,000? Is it 2,200 or 4,300? But the buyer election, because you only get one, and because you have a limited time frame to actually make your election,
right,
I want everyone to just make the repair request. The buyer election, check the box, we want a repair request, and then call the listing agent and say, I would like to negotiate a credit if that's more amenable to the seller. And the
right,
credit is better for a couple of reasons. One, it makes all our jobs easier. Dad, it makes your job easier and my job and the listing agent and the buyer's agent because we don't have to coordinate repairs. We don't have to, on the walkthrough, there should be no major surprises because we're not verifying that the work was done. We're not asking for invoices. We're not, we don't
right.
need to now make sure that the permit was closed, that they had to open up. Like, I don't want any of that. I just want money. Just give me the money. I'll deal with it later. And when you get the credit, you don't get escrows. You don't have to write all these fancy escrow agreements. So all our jobs are a lot simpler.
It's a lot easier for the realtor because the
So much
closing
easier.
phone calls are a nightmare. I mean, we all know with COVID and everything else how hard it is to get people out to do stuff.
Oh my
You're
gosh.
gonna
Yeah, it's
have it
brutal.
every single day. If
So
the
this is, I know what I'm saying could be very confusing. I'm going to try and make it really clear. Ask for the repair in the buyer election
right,
because you don't have to give receipts. You don't have to go out and get, inspections or invoices. You need an inspection, but you don't need invoices. You don't need estimates. But then try to negotiate behind the scenes for a credit. The credit is definitely the way to go. Even if the buyer thinks it's not, it still is. But, in the very least, you're doing your job. You're going to do your election, you're sending it out, and then we'll work over here on maybe thinking about a credit instead. So now we fast forward, the seller has agreed or not, because the seller doesn't have to say yes. Seller can say no. You send a
Well,
million things.
they say nothing.
They say nothing. So the seller does not have to say yes. They do not have to say no. They can just say nothing, in which case the buyer can terminate if they were defects. The buyer can actually terminate, get their deposit back, or they can move forward and close as is. Or if the seller said yes, then they're locked in. They're
Yeah,
locked in.
nothing is the same as saying no, basically.
So the
After,
repair request, Yvette, refers to the NABOR standard contract. So that is the buyer election seller response form. You have
right.
your list of defective items that you include with it, and then you also send in your inspection report. That's the NABOR standard. The couple of highlights, you don't have to put any sort of limitations on percentages, and the seller can always say no. The downside, actually, I think I have this slide up here because I'm doing something else. Here's the downside. Dad, you've seen this form from me before.
Yeah.
Here's your example. You go under contract September 1st,
45
5-day due
days.
diligence. 5 days is low. That's not very much. 5 days is really low. The last day of your due diligence or inspection period is 9/6, but they have 5 days to make their election in a NABOR contract. So now it's 9/11, and the buyer has now made their election. Well, the seller has how many days, Dad, to
And
respond?
as
10
10 days.
days. So now the last day for the seller response is 9/21. And then if the seller said no, or they said no to some of the things, now the buyer has another 5 days to possibly terminate. So we went under contract on 9/1, and we don't have an answer as to inspections and whether we're moving forward until 9/26. That's crazy. That
25
drives
days.
me bonkers. I don't like this. The buyer
And this
election.
is stress. This
Now, does
is only
FARBAR have this at all, Dad?
no.
It doesn't. So FARBAR, 5-day due diligence, they have to send their notice to the seller, to the listing agent within those 5 days. Send the days. It's all one.
Yeah.
That's good. I like that. And the seller can't say no, so there's no seller response. Maybe they go back and forth a little bit on how much these things are going to cost.
Mm.
But 9/21, you're at the beach. 9/26, you're out golfing, right?
One small point, Christian, I use the seller response period to make sure the buyer puts down their second deposit. You see the contracts where the first deposit is 3 days after the effective date, and then the second is on day 16.
Yeah.
And the buyer thinks he's gonna have a response within that time frame. I always sort of fudge it and say, well, we're working on it. We'll get back to you. But hey, where's
Yeah.
that deposit?
Well, and there's so many little landmines that an agent can find themselves in, or an
Yeah.
attorney can find themselves in. And that's a great example. What if you didn't explain that the seller has 10 days to respond? So you did a great job by negotiating a 15-day inspection period. You did an awesome job. And you send in your buyer election, you send in your
Yeah.
report, and the seller just doesn't respond. And in the meantime, they say, where's the deposit? I want the second deposit. And the buyer's
Yeah.
like, well, you haven't answered me yet. And now you got egg on your face because you didn't explain that to them. There's so many things that you could make a mistake on when explaining this to a buyer. I like as is contracts. I really do.
It's much simpler. But back on the seller's response, I always sugarcoat it. Well, we're working on it. We'll get back to you. We're getting estimates. We haven't
Yeah,
built it.
if
Yeah,
they find you on the other side of the deal, you're not going to like us very
they,
much because
they,
we're gonna use the strategy of delay, delay, delay. Where's our
they,
deposit? Where's our deposit? Where's the
and
deposit?
leave them with the impression that we're going to take care of it when we really aren't. We're looking at it.
Looking at it.
We're getting estimates. We're sending builders up because a lot of times they'll have something as effective, and it's not. They just don't know what switch to hit. I mean, I've had that a bunch.
Yeah.
So we're double checking everything. We'll get back to you. Let me know when the deposit comes in.
Let us know when the deposit comes in.
Love and
So
kiss.
you've got the information, right? If you want to make an offer on a FAR bar contract, you've got the standard, you've got the as is. The standard, you kind of have the quick and dirty. Got to make sure you're accounting for mold and radon separately. You got to evaluate those percentages and what the seller's going to be obligated to. There's a little bit more of a negotiation there, a lot more strategy involved with setting up the contract. And the seller disclosure is great, but it's not going to impact anything on the sales contract. Separately, if you're proposing an offer on a NABOR contract, on a standard NABOR contract, you don't have to do as much up front. It's a lot more user friendly on the front end, but a bit more work to actually get it through because you have those buyer election, you got the seller response, and you got to take into account line 327. It's right. So it's like, which one do you want? Do you want the make the offer easier, or do you want to make the after the fact much easier? It's tough. Terry asks a great question. I'm glad you brought it up because I did want to talk about this. What about the as is addendum? All right. I use the as is addendum in one circumstance, only. And I've never told you this, Dad. So I'll see if you agree.
I agree.
Let's say your preference is an as is contract.
My
After
son's
all
always
this, and you went on my YouTube channel and you saw my video I did on the guarantee contract, the as is contract. You're like, I love that contract, but I don't want more work for myself. So you put together a standard contract
right.
with an as is addendum, which basically means that we can cancel for any reason within our inspection period. It's a little clunky, but the benefit is if the listing agent says, we won't do an as is, we refuse an as is, you just take the addendum away and now it's a standard. I like that. That's kind of cool.
Now I'll ask you, Christian, since you were on Legal Resources, Mr. You know all these forms real well. They used to have two as is
Yeah,
addendum,
they did.
and one gave you that it's like two tracks running alongside each other.
Yeah.
If you don't terminate, you go under the standard inspection process, but the other one did not. It replaced it entirely. Are they both still there? Because I
It's a
honestly
great
don't.
question. So this is the one that I like, right? So, and I don't really like this form. I'd rather you use an as-is contract. But if
Confused.
you're doing the strategy I just talked about, where you just want one sales contract and you're really questioning whether to use the addendum or not, this is the one you want. So it replaces standard D2A and standard D2B and basically says in buyer's sole discretion, the property is not acceptable, then you can terminate. But I do believe there is another, like you said, Dad, there's another one.
There used to be, I don't know if it still is. I haven't seen one.
I think they removed
Actually,
it because it was so confusing. I don't see it.
well, nobody ever used the darn thing. So,
Yeah, so the other one was, yes, you still had standard D2B. You had all the inspections, you had buyer election, and then we also had an as-is
yeah,
addendum.
both.
You
Both.
had both. It doesn't look like it's there anymore, Dad. So I think
Yeah.
that's probably a good thing that it's not there anymore. So that's my take on it.
No, I mean, it's a
No
clever.
one,
I don't know if the other side, you might make the listing agent look silly because it's clever.
yeah.
You don't
You
want to
don't
look.
want it to be too clever. You don't want it to be too cute. I think really the goal is get it under contract, protect your customer, and get it closed. And however you think that you can accomplish all three of those, that's what you need to do.
Yeah.
So, Dad, learn one thing. What's the learn one thing from inspections, FAR bar, NABOR? What's the learn one thing you want everyone to know?
Oh boy, don't miss line 327 in NABOR. I mean,
Yep, and I'll say
watch
on FAR bar, the seller has to do those repairs. Has to do
has
those
to.
repairs. That's a big, big deal. And maybe if we learn two things, the seller disclosures are treated very differently on the two contracts.
I would only use a standard in very few situations for specific purpose with a sophisticated client because it is complicated.
And yeah, and be careful that you've carefully explained the standard contract and how the inspection language works to your buyer, because the last thing you want is for your buyer to turn on you when they say you didn't explain that to them.
Yeah,
And so to that point, work with someone who has an attorney available. We have, I'm an attorney, Dad, you're an attorney. If your client has questions, you can say to them, call the attorney. Let them help you with that.
yeah.
We support that so that we're all on the same page. I think it's a huge value add for people, and we don't charge anything extra for that. That's just part of our closing process. So thank you, Dad, for joining. Better late than never. I love it. Everybody, I wish you luck. If you have questions, if you want to work with us on your next closing, I would be honored. Good luck this spring, and call us if you need us. See ya.
Yes.